of course. Here is the paraphrased script, maintaining the same dramatic and articulate style while slightly altering the word order and sentence structure. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. History remembers William the Conqueror as the Norman Duke who changed England forever. In textbooks, he is celebrated as the victor of the Battle of Hastings in 1066. He was the man who unified a fractured kingdom, bringing continental governance to the British Isles. His name is carved into monuments, his deeds immortalized in the Bayeux tapestry. Yet behind this carefully constructed legacy of triumph lies a far darker truth, one written in the blood, ash, and screams of thousands who dared to resist his iron rule. Not merely a conqueror in the military sense was William. He was an architect of terror, a strategist who understood that fear could accomplish what armies alone could not. Calculated, systematic, and designed to break the spirit of an entire people were his methods. From the smouldering ruins of northern England to the gallows where English nobles met their end, marked by acts of cruelty that shocked even the hardened rulers of medieval Europe, was William's reign. This was a man who ordered the destruction of entire regions, who wielded starvation as a weapon, and who demonstrated through unflinching brutality that resistance would be met not with mercy but with annihilation. The chronicles of his time, penned by monks who witnessed the devastation firsthand, speak of horrors that transcended the norms of medieval warfare. With visible anguish about the atrocities committed in William's name wrote Orderic Vitalis, a Norman chronicler who had no reason to slander his own people's king. The suffering in prose that trembled with barely contained rage was documented by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled by English scribes. Even William of Malmesbury, writing decades later with the benefit of historical distance, could not disguise his revulsion at what the Conqueror had unleashed upon England. What follows is not a tale of glorious conquest, but a forensic examination of 7 specific acts that define William's true legacy. A legacy built on scorched earth, severed limbs, and mass graves. These are not myths or legends embellished by time. They are documented historical facts, corroborated by multiple sources and by archaeological evidence that continues to surface nearly a millennium later. A different facet of William's ruthlessness is revealed by each act: his willingness to commit genocide to secure power, his use of mutilation as political theater, his contempt for the sanctity of human life when it stood between him and absolute control. This is the story of how one man's ambition transformed an entire kingdom into a landscape of terror. It is the story of villages erased from existence, of children who starved because William ordered every source of food destroyed, of men who were blinded and castrated for the crime of defending their homeland. It is the story of how medieval Europe, no stranger to violence, recoiled in horror at the systematic brutality of the Norman conquest. And it is the story of how William the Conqueror earned a second, darker title in the whispered conversations of his terrified subjects. William the Bastard, who proved that cruelty, when wielded with sufficient determination, could indeed conquer a nation. The blood has long since dried on the stones of England's castles. The ashes of burned villages have been scattered by centuries of wind. But the memory of what William did, what he ordered, what he permitted, what he justified, remains embedded in the historical record like a scar that refuses to fade. This is that record. This is the true cost of conquest. This is the legacy that textbooks often choose to omit. Welcome to the dark side of 1066. Welcome to the reign of William the Conqueror. Let us begin. The harrying of the North, campaign of systematic genocide. The greatest challenge since Hastings was faced by William in the winter of 1069. The north of England, that wild and defiant region beyond the Humber, had risen in open rebellion. An unlikely alliance had been formed by Anglo-Saxon nobles, Danish raiders, and Scottish opportunists, united by their hatred of Norman rule. They had stormed York, massacred the Norman garrison, and declared their independence from William's authority. For a king whose power rested entirely on the perception of invincibility, this was not merely a military setback. It was an existential threat that demanded a response so overwhelming, so total that no one would ever dare rebel again. What William unleashed upon northern England in the months that follow would become known to history as the harrying of the North. A campaign of devastation so complete, so merciless that it would leave scars visible in the archaeological record nearly 1,000 years later. This was not war in the medieval sense where armies clashed and castles were besieged. This was deliberate, calculated genocide. Not just the rebel forces, but the very capacity of the North to sustain human life was ordered to be destroyed by William. Every village, every farm, every source of food and shelter was to be obliterated. The goal was not conquest. It was extinction. With methodical precision, the campaign began. Organized into mobile columns, Norman forces swept through Yorkshire, Durham, Northumbria, and parts of what is now Cumbria and Lancashire. Specific orders they carried: burn every building, slaughter every animal, destroy every tool that could be used for farming. Set ablaze in the fields were standing crops. Scattered and burned was stored grain. Smashed were ploughs. Demolished were mills. Sunk were fishing boats. Cut down or burned were orchards that had taken decades to mature. Even seed grain, the precious reserve that farmers set aside to plant next year's crop, was destroyed or contaminated. Not satisfied with victory was William. He wanted to make survival itself impossible. What followed was documented by Orderic Vitalis, a Norman monk writing in the early 12th century, with prose that could barely contain his horror. He described how the survivors, those who had managed to flee the advancing Norman armies, began to starve as winter tightened its grip. With no shelter, no food, and no means to acquire either, tens of thousands of people faced a choice between starvation and cannibalism. Of finding bodies on the roads, of corpses half-eaten by the desperate living, of parents who had killed and consumed their own children, wrote Orderic. All pretense of objectivity was abandoned by the chronicler, normally restrained in his judgments. He called the harrying of the North a crime that stained William's soul, an act for which the king would answer to God. Chilling statistical evidence of the devastation is provided by the Domesday Book, compiled 17 years later in 1086. Entry after entry in the northern sections notes simply, waste, land that had been productive before 1069, but was now abandoned, depopulated, incapable of generating any revenue for the crown. Vanished had entire villages, their names preserved only in the Domesday Survey. That between 100,000 and 150,000 people died as a direct result of the harrying is estimated by modern historians analyzing the data with demographic models. Roughly 5 to 10% of England's entire population at the time. To put this in perspective, it would be equivalent to a modern government deliberately causing the death of millions of its own citizens. Physical evidence that corroborates the written accounts has been uncovered by archaeological excavations in Yorkshire and Durham. Clear signs of sudden abandonment around 1069 to 1070 are shown by excavated villages, with hearths left cold midwinter and tools discarded where they lay. A dramatic change in vegetation patterns during this period is revealed by pollen analysis of peat bogs, with cultivated species disappearing and being replaced by wild grasses and scrub, evidence that farming had ceased entirely across vast regions. Signs of malnutrition and disease consistent with famine are shown by bodies in mass graves discovered near former village sites. What was done is borne witness to by the land itself. With shock reacted contemporary observers across Europe when news of the harrying reached them. Grave concern about the scale of the devastation was reportedly expressed by Pope Alexander II, who had blessed William's invasion in 1066. The atrocity was used by the King of France, Philip I, to vilify William in diplomatic correspondence, calling him a tyrant who ruled through terror rather than law. Troubled seemed even William's own Norman nobility. That some Norman lords quietly protested the severity of the campaign is suggested by several sources, though none dared do so openly. The bounds of acceptable medieval violence had been exceeded by the harrying, crossing the invisible line that separated warfare from wanton slaughter. Never did William express regret. When confronted with the moral implications of what he had ordered, he is said to have replied that harsh measures were necessary to establish peace, according to later accounts, a chilling example of how rulers throughout history have justified atrocities in the name of stability. But not in William's rationalizations lies the true measure of the harrying's impact, but in the decades it took for northern England to recover. For generations, some regions remained depopulated. Not until well into the 12th century did the North's economy, which had been vibrant and productive before 1069, fully recover. To break the North's will to resist had been William's desire. He succeeded, but the price was paid in mass graves, in villages that would never be rebuilt, in a trauma that echoed through generations. Not merely one of William's crimes was the harrying of the North. It was, by any reasonable definition, genocide. Mutilation as statecraft, the politics of severed limbs. In medieval Europe, more than flesh and bone was the human body. It was a canvas upon which power could be written. That punishment, when properly displayed, could serve as both retribution and deterrent was understood by kings and nobles. But even by the brutal standards of the 11th century, shocked his contemporaries did William the Conqueror's systematic use of mutilation as a tool of governance. He did not merely execute rebels. He maimed them, blinded them, castrated them, and then released them to live as walking advertisements for the consequences of defiance. These were not spontaneous acts of violence committed in the heat of battle. They were deliberate, calculated performances of power, stage-managed to instill terror throughout his realm. Not new to the 11th century was the practice of judicial mutilation, but William weaponized it with unprecedented zeal. Reserved for specific crimes had mutilation been under Anglo-Saxon law. A hand might be lost by thieves, a tongue by perjurers. But both the scope and scale of such punishments were expanded by William, applying them liberally to anyone who challenged Norman authority. More importantly, the theatrical dimension of public mutilation was understood by him. Not simply maimed and discarded were victims. They were maimed in public squares in front of assembled crowds with the explicit intention of creating spectacles of suffering that would be discussed and feared throughout the kingdom. One of the most extensively documented cases involves the rebels of Exeter in 1068. When the city finally surrendered after a prolonged siege, swift and theatrical was William's vengeance. The blinding of several prominent citizens who had led the resistance was ordered by the king, according to William of Malmesbury. The procedure, primitive and agonizing, involved heating metal rods until they glowed red, then pressing them directly into the victim's eyes, destroying the corneas and optic nerves. Paraded through the streets were the victims before being released to stumble blind through the countryside, living reminders of what awaited those who opposed the Norman king. Unmistakable was the message. Your sight, your most basic connection to the world, could be robbed by William, and you could be forced to live on as a testament to his power. A different symbolic function was served by castration, one rooted in medieval concepts of masculinity and dynastic power. For noble rebels, particularly those with claims to lands or titles, castration was not just physical torture. It was genealogical annihilation. No heirs could be fathered by a castrated man, no dynasty established, his name or his claim could not be passed on to future generations. When William ordered the castration of captured English nobles, he was not merely punishing individuals. He was erasing bloodlines, severing the threads that connected Anglo-Saxon aristocracy to their ancestral lands. Instances where entire groups of captive nobles were castrated en masse are recorded by several chronicles. Their severed testicles were sometimes displayed publicly as grotesque trophies. Yet another purpose was served by the amputation of hands and feet, the creation of living symbols of powerlessness. A sword could not be wielded by a man without hands, a plough could not be worked, he could barely feed himself. Could not walk a man without feet, could not flee, could not stand as an equal among his peers. Proud warriors and prosperous farmers were transformed into dependent beggars by these mutilations, objects of pity rather than respect. Such men on the roads of Normandy and England are described by Orderic Vitalis as encountering former soldiers reduced to crawling on stumps, former craftsmen unable to practice their trades, all bearing William's mark upon their bodies. Its combination with mercy was what made William's use of mutilation particularly effective, or rather the perverse imitation of mercy. Unlike execution, which was final and could create martyrs, mutilation allowed victims to survive and spread fear. That a blind man stumbling through a marketplace or a castrated noble forced to watch his estates pass to Norman lords was more valuable than a corpse in a grave seemed to be grasped instinctively by William. Involuntary propagandists for Norman power became these maimed survivors. More eloquent than any proclamation were their ruined bodies. "This is what happens to those who resist," was reminded every person who saw them. And unlike a corpse that could be buried and forgotten, a mutilated victim remained visible, a permanent exhibit in William's Museum of Terror. Beyond political rebels to common criminals extended the practice, particularly those guilty of poaching on Norman-controlled hunting grounds. Imported from Normandy and imposed with rigid severity, forest law made hunting royal game a capital offense, or worse. Blinding, castration, or the amputation of fingers, hands, or feet faced poachers caught in the king's forests, depending on William's mood and the perceived severity of the offence. Bitter complaints about these punishments are recorded by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, noting that Englishmen were being mutilated for trying to feed their families by hunting deer in forests their ancestors had freely used for centuries. Into exclusive hunting preserves had William turned entire regions, and the bodies of English peasants paid the price for his sport. Cannot be quantified the long-term psychological impact of William's mutilation campaign, but it permeates the sources. A kingdom living in constant fear is described by English writers, where men were afraid to speak freely, to gather in groups, to question Norman authority in even the mildest terms. Over every interaction with Norman officials hung the threat of mutilation like an invisible blade, and that was precisely his intention. That you did not need to mutilate everyone to control everyone had been discovered by him. You only needed to mutilate enough people in sufficiently public ways to make the threat ubiquitous. In this sense, not just a victim was every blind beggar, every castrated noble, every handless peasant, but a tool, an instrument through which William maintained his grip on a conquered and traumatized population. The body politic of England had been inscribed with the signature of its conqueror, written in scar tissue and missing limbs, a text that could be read by all and forgotten by none. The Great Dispossession, raising Anglo-Saxon England. Conquest is often measured in battles won and territories claimed. But that true domination required something more fundamental was understood by William the Conqueror, the complete restructuring of who owned England itself. In the 2 decades following Hastings, one of history's most thorough transfers of wealth and land was orchestrated by William, systematically stripping the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy of their ancestral estates and redistributing them to his Norman followers. This was not merely confiscation. It was cultural genocide accomplished through legal mechanisms, the erasure of an entire ruling class written into charters and sealed with wax, made permanent through the meticulous record-keeping that would culminate in the Domesday Book. A complex network of Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Danish nobles whose families had held their lands for generations, sometimes for centuries, had governed England before 1066. These were the Thegns, the earls, the minor nobility whose estates formed the economic and political foundation of pre-conquest England. On ancient traditions of land tenure, on customary rights that predated written law, on networks of kinship and obligation that stretched back to the days of Alfred the Great rested their power. Almost completely eliminated had this entire class by 1086, when the Domesday Survey was complete. Only 2 significant Anglo-Saxon landholders remained in possession of substantial estates. Less than 5% of the land was still in English hands. To Normans had been given the rest. Brutally simple, but legally sophisticated was the mechanism of dispossession. The rightful heir to Edward the Confessor was declared by William, claiming that all land in England belonged to the crown by right of conquest and succession. These lands were then graciously granted to his followers as fiefs, holding them in exchange for military service and loyalty. The more fluid Anglo-Saxon arrangement was replaced by this Norman feudal system at a stroke, and any English noble who wished to retain his land had to petition the king for a regrant, essentially begging to receive back as a gift what had been his family's property by ancient right. Many were refused. Those who were granted back some portion of their lands discovered they now held them on completely different terms, subject to Norman law and Norman customs they barely understood. But most Anglo-Saxon nobles never got the chance to petition. A variety of pretexts to justify wholesale confiscation was employed by William. Any nobleman who had fought at Hastings or in any subsequent rebellion automatically forfeited all his lands. Deemed traitors were those who had supported Harold Godwin's son, even passively. Lost everything were those who failed to immediately swear fealty to William. Stripped of their estates were those who swore fealty but were later accused of plotting against the king, accusations that were easy to manufacture and impossible to disprove. Even those who managed to retain some land in the early years often lost it later as Norman pressure and legal chicanery gradually whittled away their holdings until they were left with nothing. Catastrophic was the human impact of this dispossession. Landless, penniless, reduced to refugee status in their own country found entire families who had been wealthy and powerful. To Scotland, to Scandinavia, to the continent fled some, carrying with them bitter tales of Norman treachery. Others stayed and tried to make their peace with the new order, accepting minor positions in the households of Norman lords who now ruled their ancestral lands. To brigandage turned still others, becoming the outlaws and resistance fighters who populate English folklore, men like Hereward the Wake, whose desperate guerrilla campaign in the Fens became legendary precisely because it was so exceptional, so hopeless, so doomed. William's Norman followers were the beneficiaries of this massive redistribution, a relatively small group of opportunistic warriors and administrators who found themselves suddenly among the wealthiest men in Europe. This transformation with shocking precision allows us to be tracked by the Domesday Book. Vast estates across multiple counties were received by William Fitzosborne, the king's closest friend. One of the largest landholders in England became Robert of Mortain, William's half-brother. Enough wealth to rival the king himself was accumulated by Odo of Bayeux, another half-brother, and a bishop. Lords of English manors found themselves lesser Norman knights who had gambled everything on the invasion, ruling over English peasants who could barely pronounce their foreign names. Far beyond the aristocracy extended the psychological impact of this dispossession. As the local lords they had known all their lives were replaced by French-speaking foreigners who knew nothing of English customs and cared nothing for English welfare, watched English peasants. Their own agricultural practices, their own legal systems, their own expectations of rent and service were imposed by Norman lords. Disrupted were the familiar rhythms of rural life. Swept aside in favor of written contracts in Latin that few Englishmen could read were traditional agreements between lord and tenant, often based on verbal understandings passed down through generations. Under rigid Norman control found themselves villages that had operated with a degree of autonomy, their movements restricted, their obligations increased, their ancient rights dismissed as irrelevant under the new regime. So total, so systematic was the dispossession that it fundamentally altered the trajectory of English history. Erased in a single generation was the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, which had survived Viking invasions, dynastic upheavals, and civil wars. Not just land and wealth, but cultural continuity went with it. The language of law and literature had once been the English language, it became the tongue of peasants and servants. Marginalized or abandoned were English artistic traditions, architectural styles, and literary forms. A colony of Normandy became England for a time, governed by foreigners for the benefit of foreigners. To second-class status in the land of their birth was reduced its native population. And through careful planning was all of this accomplished, through legal documents and administrative records, through the methodical application of a conqueror's will, not through random pillage. He rewrote it, property by property, charter by charter, until the England that had existed before 1066 was nothing but a memory preserved in the bitter complaints of a dispossessed people. Did William not simply take England? Rivers of blood, the civilian massacres. Rules had medieval warfare, unwritten perhaps, but generally understood. Armies fought armies. Soldiers killed soldiers. While often caught in the crossfire, civilians were not typically targeted for systematic slaughter. Not because medieval warriors were particularly humanitarian, but because valuable were civilians. They paid taxes, worked the land, produced the goods that made a territory worth conquering in the first place. The civilian population was preserved by a wise conqueror because they represented future revenue. A wise man in many respects was William the Conqueror, but a brutal pragmatism that overrode such considerations was revealed by his invasion of England. When faced with resistance, William did not hesitate to order the massacre of civilians on a scale that shocked even his own contemporaries. Almost immediately after Hastings began the massacres. As William's army advanced through southeastern England in late 1066, they encountered scattered resistance from English militias and outraged peasants. Disproportionate and decisive was William's response. Burned to the ground with their inhabitants inside were villages suspected of harboring rebels. Rounded up and executed were men of fighting age, often by hanging, sometimes by more creative methods designed to maximize terror. Not spared were women and children if they were caught in towns that resisted. Indiscriminate killing in the streets, bodies left to rot as warnings to other communities considering resistance are described by contemporary sources. This was not the fog of war. It was deliberate policy. At the Siege of Exeter in 1068 occurred the most extensively documented massacre. After the city surrendered following a bitter 18-day siege, a selective purge of the population was reportedly ordered by William. The city's leaders were punished with the mutilations described earlier, but beyond that, license to exact revenge for the siege were given to Norman soldiers. Uncertain is how many died. Contradictory numbers are offered by chronicles, but that the streets ran with blood, that bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried, that the stench of death hung over Exeter for weeks are agreed upon by multiple sources. Its purpose was served by the massacre. After Exeter, other English towns surrendered rather than face similar treatment. But individual massacres, horrific as they were, paled in comparison to William's systematic policy regarding survivors of conquered territories. A fate that medieval observers considered worse often faced those who did not die in the initial violence, enslavement. Declining in much of Western Europe had been the slave trade by the 11th century, but a sudden glut of human merchandise was produced by William's conquest. Thousands of English men, women, and children were rounded up after rebellions, chained together in columns, and marched to ports for shipment to slave markets in Europe and the Mediterranean. So extensive was the trade that it drew complaints from religious authorities, including Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury, who protested the sale of Christians as slaves. Brutal and efficient was the enslavement process itself. After a successful military campaign, through the surrounding countryside would sweep Norman soldiers, capturing anyone who had fled. For their potential labor value were men evaluated. The young and strong were kept for heavy work or sold abroad, while the old and weak were often simply killed as economically worthless. Particularly valuable in the slave trade were women and children, women for domestic service and sexual exploitation, children because they could be trained and would provide years of labor. Without ceremony were families separated. Their children dragged away in chains watched parents. To different buyers were spouses sold. Not prisoners of war in any recognized sense were these. They were simply people who had the misfortune to live in the wrong place when William's army passed through. Some slaves remained in England, put to work building the castles that would symbolize Norman domination. The rapid construction of hundreds of motte-and-bailey fortifications across England in the decade after Hastings required enormous amounts of manual labor, digging ditches, moving earth, cutting timber, hauling stone. By enslaved English workers toiling under Norman overseers was much of this work performed, building the very structures that would ensure their continued subjugation. The irony was lost on no one. Bodies bearing signs of overwork, malnutrition, and untreated injuries, likely the remains of workers who did not survive the brutal pace of construction, have been revealed by archaeological excavations of some Norman construction sites in burial pits. In fragmentary records from continental markets can be glimpsed the scale of the slave trade generated by William's conquest. A notorious reputation as a center of the slave trade developed by Bristol, a major English port, with ships regularly departing for Ireland, Scandinavia, and beyond. A significant influx of English captives in the years after 1066 was seen by Dublin slave markets. Oblique references to English thralls acquired during this period are even made by Icelandic sagas. Incalculable is the human cost, but that tens of thousands of English people were enslaved as a direct result of William's invasion and the rebellions it provoked is suggested by conservative estimates. Particularly striking is the calculated nature of what makes William's civilian massacres and enslavement policies. These were not atrocities committed by an army out of control, driven by bloodlust and looting instinct. They were deliberate strategies authorized from the top, designed to accomplish specific political and economic goals. The massacres destroyed resistance. The enslavement punished rebellion while generating revenue and labor. Together they created a climate of absolute terror that made further resistance seem suicidal. A bitter lesson had been learned by the English population by 1070. Death in honest battle did not mean opposing William, but massacre if you fought and slavery if you survived. It was a lesson written in the burned ruins of villages, in the empty spaces where towns had stood, in the faces of the chained columns of prisoners being marched to the coast. And it was a lesson that would not be forgotten for generations. Fortresses of oppression, the castle system. More than walls and towers is a castle. It is a statement of power made tangible, an architectural argument that cannot be refuted, a permanent assertion of dominance over the landscape and the people who inhabit it. This with the clarity of genius was understood by William the Conqueror. In the years following 1066, The construction of hundreds of castles across England was ordered by him, more fortifications built more quickly than in any comparable period in European history. Not merely defensive structures designed to protect Norman garrisons were these. They were instruments of occupation, watchtowers from which foreign soldiers could survey conquered territory, symbols of subjugation visible for miles around. And for the English people forced to build them, to live beneath their shadows, something else entirely was represented by the castles, the permanent reality of their defeat. An exercise in ruthless efficiency and brutal disregard for English welfare was the construction process itself. When William decided a castle was needed in a particular location, no consideration was given to existing structures or inhabitants. The demolition of entire neighborhoods was required by urban castles like those built in London, York, Lincoln, and Norwich. Simply cleared away to make room for fortifications were hundreds of homes, churches, workshops, and businesses. No compensation, no alternative housing was received by the displaced families. They were cast out into the streets, their property destroyed, their lives upended, all to accommodate the military needs of their conquerors. Bitter complaints about these destructions are recorded by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, noting that ancient communities were erased overnight to serve Norman interests. From forced English conscription came the labor to build these castles largely. The continental practice of corvée labor, compulsory work owed to feudal lords, was imported by the Normans and applied with ruthless enthusiasm. To abandon their farms during crucial planting or harvest seasons were ordered English peasants, to dig ditches, move earth, cut timber, and haul stone for castle construction. Those who refused were punished, often with the mutilations described earlier. Their livelihoods destroyed found those who complied. No crop meant missing planting season, which meant no food for the winter, which meant starvation for their families. Quickly rose the castles, but they rose on the broken backs of English labor. With English suffering was cemented each stone. As bases for systematic oppression served the castles once completed. With Norman soldiers who had explicit license to enforce Norman law over the surrounding territory was garrisoned each fortress. With impunity raided these garrisons English villages, confiscating food, livestock, and goods as they pleased. Routinely assaulted were English women by Norman soldiers who knew they would face no consequences. Beaten, imprisoned, or killed were English men who protested. A symbol of injustice itself became the castle. A place where Englishmen were tried under foreign law they did not understand. Sentenced by foreign judges who did not speak their language, punished according to Norman customs that bore no resemblance to Anglo-Saxon tradition. Cannot be overstated the psychological impact of living under castle surveillance. In pre-conquest England, relatively diffuse had been political power. By local assemblies were managed local affairs. And while there were certainly hierarchies and injustices, a sense that English people had some agency in their own governance also existed. That illusion ended completely by the castles. Every English community within sight of a Norman fortress, which, given the density of castle construction, meant most communities, lived under the constant awareness of being watched, monitored, controlled. A permanent reminder that Norman soldiers could descend at any moment, that Norman law superseded English custom, that resistance was futile because the Normans had built their power into the very landscape was the castle on the hill. William's sophisticated understanding of occupation logistics is revealed by the strategic placement of castles. At key transportation nodes, river crossings, road junctions, coastal ports, were built major castles, where they could control movement and commerce. To create overlapping zones of control were positioned secondary castles, ensuring that no region was beyond quick reach of Norman military force. Particularly high was the density in areas that had shown rebellious tendencies. With castles was ringed Yorkshire after the harrying of the north. With fortifications bristled the Welsh marches. Their share of Norman strongholds received even relatively peaceful regions because William trusted no one and assumed that any English community might revolt if given the chance. Overwhelmingly on the English fell the economic burden of the castle system. Not only were they forced to build the structures, but they were then required to support the garrisons that occupied them. Food, fuel, and supplies for the Norman soldiers who oppressed them had to be provided by local populations. A bitter irony that was noted by contemporary chroniclers with undisguised anger. Ruinous was the cost. Impoverished by the constant demands of nearby garrisons found villages that had been moderately prosperous before 1066. Numerous estates whose value had plummeted since the conquest are recorded by the Domesday Book, and castle construction and support is frequently cited as the cause. A system where the English paid for the infrastructure of their own subjugation had William effectively created. An estimated 500 to 600 castles bristled England by 1086, an astonishing number for a kingdom of its size. One of the most intensive fortification programs in medieval history was represented by this, comparable to what later colonial powers would build in conquered territories centuries later. And that comparison is apt because precisely the colonial function was served by William's castles. They were forward operating bases in hostile territory, islands of Norman power in a sea of sullen English resentment. England's physical landscape was transformed by them while simultaneously transforming its political reality. Before the castles, possible had seemed English resistance, even plausible. After the castles, confronting fortified positions manned by professional soldiers meant rebellion, an insurmountable tactical obstacle. Not just England's skyline did the castles dominate. They dominated England's imagination, crushing hope with their mere presence. Not merely conquered had William England. He had built his conquest into every valley and hilltop, making Norman dominance as permanent as stone itself. Sacred plunder, the violation of God's houses. In medieval Christendom, inviolate was supposed to be the church. Sanctuaries protected by divine law and human custom were monasteries and churches. Not merely a crime against man, but a sin against God was to attack the church. An offense that would damn the perpetrator's immortal soul. Reverence or at least restraint when it came to ecclesiastical property were expected to be shown by kings and warriors who might slaughter each other with abandon. William the Conqueror, who had secured papal blessing for his invasion and who would later be remembered as a pious benefactor of Norman monasteries, showed no such restraint when it came to English religious institutions. He looted them, taxed them, suppressed them, and when necessary, destroyed them, all while maintaining the fiction of Christian virtue. Immediately after Hastings during William's march to London began the pillaging. With at least tacit approval from their commanders, Norman soldiers operating raided monasteries and churches along the route, seizing gold and silver vessels, stripping altars of their ornaments, confiscating illuminated manuscripts for their jeweled covers while discarding the priceless texts themselves. That these were spoils of war, the legitimate rewards of victory, was the justification when one was offered. But not military installations were the targets. They were houses of worship, repositories of sacred art and learning, communities of monks and nuns who posed no military threat to anyone. Methodical and thorough was the desecration, so much so that many English ecclesiastical institutions never recovered their pre-conquest wealth. Particularly egregious was what made William's treatment of the English Church its combination of material greed and political calculation. That the Church was not merely a religious institution but a repository of wealth, learning, and cultural authority was understood by him. The institutional capacity of potential centers of resistance was diminished by him simultaneously while enriching his treasury by stripping English monasteries and bishoprics of their treasures. Strongholds of learning had English monasteries been, producing the manuscripts and maintaining the schools that preserved Anglo-Saxon culture. Their ability to continue this cultural work was crippled by him by confiscating their wealth. Not just the economic power of the English Church, but its role as the guardian of English identity was to undermine the effect. Particularly controversial was the taxation of monasteries. In 1070, extraordinary levies on English religious houses to fund his ongoing military campaigns and administrative reforms were imposed by William. Ruinous were these taxes. To sell land, release servants, and reduce their charitable activities just to meet Norman demands found monasteries that had been self-sufficient for centuries. Their remaining treasures, chalices, reliquaries, liturgical vessels, to foreign creditors had to be pawned by some institutions. Open outrage was expressed by contemporary monastic chroniclers, normally circumspect in their political commentary. As sacrilege was described the taxation by Orderic Vitalis. To the biblical enemies of Israel, plunderers of the temple, was compared William by Eadmer of Canterbury. Not casual criticisms were these. They were accusations of impiety from within William's own Christian framework. Systematically replaced with Norman appointees were also English bishops and abbots by William, purge that was as much about control as about ecclesiastical reform. In the 2 decades following the conquest, nearly every significant position in the English church hierarchy was transferred to Norman clerics. On pretexts ranging from simony to incompetence to insufficient loyalty to the new regime were English bishops deposed. Uniformly Norman were their replacements, men who owed their positions entirely to William and who could be relied upon to support his policies. Not reform was this. It was occupation. One of the most vital and independent institutions in pre-conquest England had been the English Church. It became an arm of Norman government, staffed by foreigners and oriented toward foreign interests. Substantial was the human cost of this ecclesiastical revolution. Under the authority of Norman superiors who despised English customs, dismissed English saints as provincial obscurities, and viewed the English language itself as barbarous, found English monks and nuns themselves suppressed in favor of continental norms were ancient liturgical practices specific to English tradition. Neglected or actively destroyed were manuscripts in Old English, including works of immense historical and literary value, because the Norman clergy could not read them and saw no reason to preserve them. Marginalized was the cult of English saints, figures like Edmund, Edward, and Dunstan, who had been central to English religious life. Its own distinctive character, its own traditions, its own voice had been possessed by the English Church. It was forcibly assimilated into a Norman ecclesiastical order that viewed Englishness as something to be corrected. To physical structures extended the destruction as well. While William did sponsor the construction of new Norman-style cathedrals and abbey churches, massive Romanesque structures that still dominate the English landscape, these were built alongside, and sometimes literally on top of, demolished Anglo-Saxon churches. By the new was systematically replaced the old, often using stone and materials salvaged from destroyed English buildings. Architectural colonialism was this, the imposition of Norman aesthetic and structural principles on a conquered landscape. And expensive it was. Not by William's treasury, but by the English communities forced to provide labor and materials for churches that represented the physical manifestation of their cultural dispossession was borne the cost. Throughout his life maintained William that he was a faithful son of the Church, and in Norman territories he was indeed a generous benefactor of religious institutions. But the limits of his piety are revealed by his treatment of the English Church. When ecclesiastical institutions stood in the way of his political and economic interests, no hesitation in violating the sanctity that was supposed to protect them was shown by him. He plundered when it suited him, taxed when he needed funds, and suppressed when control required it. And all of this was done while maintaining the appearance of Christian devotion, attending Mass regularly, consulting with bishops, making strategic donations to favored monasteries. Contemporary observers did not escape the contradiction. A man who honored God with one hand while desecrating God's houses.